He laughed in a child's face, insisting a woman like her couldn't be a hero in the nation's most elite forces. The girl stood frozen, tears burning her eyes, until the automatic doors slid open. And the truth, wearing her full blue dress uniform, walked in. If you believe that courage knows no color and that dignity is non-negotiable, you need to see what happened next and hit subscribe so you never miss a story of honor being restored. But to understand the weight of that moment, we have to go back 5 minutes to a quiet conversation in the shoe aisle. The world, for 12-year-old Layla Hayes, was a bright, simple place. It smelled like new rubber and clean fabric inside the cavernous Summit Outfitters store at the Northgate Galleria Mall. Fluorescent lights gleamed off the polished concrete floors, and the air hummed with the quiet energy of weekend shoppers. Layla, with her braids adorned with colorful beads that clicked softly as she moved, was deep in the most important debate of the afternoon with her best friend, Chloe Kim. Which pair of Aeroflex sneakers had the best color scheme? Layla held up a box, flipping the lid open and shut. "I just don't know," she sighed with the dramatic weight only a 12-year-old can muster. "The blue is classic, but the red is fast." Chloe giggled, a sound that bounced between the tall shelves. "You're not picking them up today anyway, are you? I thought your mom was getting you." "She is," Layla said, carefully placing the box back on the shelf. "But she's not picking me up until she's done at Camp Lejeune. She's the battalion sergeant major there now, but before that she was a Marine Raider." She said it with the same casual ease she might use to describe her favorite cereal. It was just a fact of her life. But to Chloe, it was a revelation. Her eyes widened. "Wait, your mom's in the Marines? Like, a real Marine?" "Yeah," Layla confirmed, a small bloom of pride warming her chest. "She's a sergeant major, Ava Hayes." It should have been a fleeting moment of childhood bragging, a small, innocent boast that would have evaporated into the air-conditioned atmosphere of the store. But a sound from a few feet away cut through their conversation. It wasn't a chuckle of amusement. It was a sharp, dismissive bark of a laugh, a sound designed to shrink you, to make you feel small. Standing by a rack of local team hoodies was a man in his late 40s. He was dressed in jeans and a faded polo shirt, clearly off-duty. It was Deputy Mark Ellison from the Jasper County Sheriff's Office, a man whose face was familiar from local news stories. The gold star patch of his department was visible on a jacket slung over his arm, and when he shifted, the subtle outline of a concealed holster printed against the fabric of his shirt. The laugh was his, and it carried the weight of someone used to being listened to. "Marine Raider," he said, shaking his head with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. He took a step closer, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere. "Come on, kid. I've worked with military guys my whole career. I know the type. The real ones, the operators, they have a certain quiet intensity. They don't advertise. Your mom being a raider? That's Hollywood stuff, kid. Real life is different." The words, coming from a law enforcement officer, landed with a heavier thud. This wasn't just a random shopper's opinion. It felt like an official judgment. Layla's face flushed a deep, hot red. She could feel the eyes of other shoppers on her, could see a mother with a toddler in a cart lingering nearby. Her browsing suddenly very slow, her ears tuned to the unfolding drama. This laugh wasn't meant to be shared. It was meant to belittle. And it was just the beginning. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to buzz louder, each one a spotlight on her humiliation. Her cheeks burned, a hot, creeping shame that started in her chest and spread to the tips of her ears. The world, which a moment ago had been a wide open space of possibility, filled with fast red sneakers, had shrunk to the size of this man's smirk. She wanted the polished floor to open up and swallow her whole. The bright colors of the shoes seemed to mock her, suddenly too loud, too cheerful for the storm brewing inside her. But a flicker of her mother's stubbornness, a resilience forged in places Layla could only imagine, sparked inside her. She pressed her lips into a thin, determined line. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of him. Her mind retreated, pulling her back to a memory, a safe harbor against the rising tide of shame. She was 9. It was late, the moon a pale sliver in the dark sky. She had crept out of her room, unable to sleep, and found her mother sitting at the kitchen table, her combat uniform still on, caked with the dust of a place thousands of miles away. Her boots were on the floor beside her, thick with dried mud. Her mother wasn't a superhero in that moment. She was just Mom. Tired. She was slowly cleaning her rifle, her movements methodical, practiced, her hands that could braid Layla's hair with such gentleness, now showing the calluses of her profession. Layla had stood in the doorway, a small shadow. "Was it scary, Mom?" she had whispered. Ava had looked up, and the exhaustion in her eyes was momentarily replaced by a deep, unwavering love. She didn't lie. "Sometimes," she had answered softly. "But thinking about coming home to you, Layla, that makes me brave." That memory was real, the smell of gun oil and distant lands, the weight of her mother's fatigue, the strength in her quiet voice. That was her truth. "It's true," Layla said, her voice barely a whisper, but it was steady now. It was the sound of a small anchor holding fast. That quiet defiance only seemed to amuse Deputy Ellison more, and he decided to make her an example. He turned his body slightly, no longer speaking just to Layla, but to the small, curious audience that had gathered. "Look, I get it," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It's a cute story. My nephew used to tell everyone his dad was a secret agent. Kids like to make things up to feel special, but you don't have to make up fairy tales to be proud of your mom." Chloe, ever loyal, grabbed Layla's arm. Her whisper was urgent, a frantic plea. "Let's go, Layla. Just ignore him." But Layla pulled her arm away gently. She couldn't run. Running felt like admitting he was right. Running felt like betraying the woman who had taught her to stand tall, the woman who came home smelling of dust and bravery. "It's not a fairy tale," she repeated, her voice a little stronger this time, fueled by the fresh memory of her mother's tired smile. That single act of courage, however small, was like a challenge to Deputy Ellison, and he was more than happy to accept it. He leaned back against the rack of hoodies, crossing his arms. The gesture was casual, but his posture was that of a man settling in for a show he was directing. He was enjoying this. The power he felt in this small, trivial moment was radiating from him. "A fairy tale is exactly what it is, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying easily across the aisle. "And the sooner you learn the difference between stories and reality, the better. The guys who do that job, they're a different breed. Years of brutal training, combat tours. They have a certain look. And trust me," he paused, letting the words hang in the air for maximum impact. "They don't look like your mom." With that one sentence, Ellison had crossed a line. He wasn't just questioning a story anymore. He was questioning a person's right to exist in a role he couldn't imagine for them. The insult was no longer just about a job title. It was personal, aimed at the very image of her black mother that Layla held in her heart. Chloe gasped, her loyalty overriding her fear. "That's not fair. You don't even know her." Ellison turned his dismissive gaze on Chloe. "And you do? What? Did you two sit around swapping war stories? Please." A teenager standing near the checkout line, wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled up, exchanged a look with his friend. The friend nudged him, a smirk on his face, and the first teenager discreetly pulled out his phone. He held it up, less discreetly now, the lens clearly aimed at the confrontation. Ellison saw it. His smile tightened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of annoyance, but he quickly recovered, seemingly emboldened by the camera, as if it were a stage light inviting him to perform. This quiet humiliation was now a public spectacle, and he was the star. Layla saw the phone too, and a fresh wave of nausea washed over her. Now her shame would have a life beyond this moment, a digital ghost that could follow her forever. She felt trapped. The walls of Sneakers seemed to be closing in, the bright colors blurring through the unshed tears in her eyes. The floor tiles, with their bland, repeating pattern, seemed to mock her. She stared down at them, trying to find a focal point, anything to anchor herself in the spinning vortex of embarrassment. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, a calm, steady presence from 1,000 different moments. "Courage isn't about not being afraid, Layla. It's about standing your ground when you are." She took a shaky breath, the air catching in her throat. She lifted her chin, her eyes still fixed on the floor, and whispered, her voice cracking, "You'll see. She's coming." Ellison laughed again, a full-throated sound of victory. "Sure she is," he jeered. "Tell you what," he said, his voice booming now, making sure everyone could hear his magnanimous offer. He gestured toward the wall of Aeroflex shoes. "If your mom walks in here in uniform, I'll buy you those sneakers myself." He leaned back, crossing his arms again, a smug king on his temporary throne of athletic wear. "I'll wait." The air grew thick with anticipation. The crowd waited. The mother with the stroller had stopped pretending to shop and was now watching openly, her expression a mixture of pity and disapproval. She pulled her cart back a few feet, a subtle act of distancing her own child from the toxicity of the scene. The teenagers were whispering, their phones still pointed in Layla's direction, every second stretched into an eternity. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to grow louder, a monotonous drone that amplified the suffocating silence. Layla could feel her resolve crumbling, the weight of his disbelief pressing down on her, squeezing the air from her lungs. She could feel the stares of the strangers, some pitiful, some amused, all of them witnesses to her humiliation. And just as she felt she couldn't stand it for another second, a new sound cut through the silence. It wasn't the soft shuffle of shoppers or the distant pop music from the mall's speakers. It was a different sound, the distinct, rhythmic strike of military dress shoes on polished tile. Steady, purposeful, unmistakable. A cadence of authority that announced its arrival before it was seen. The automatic doors at the front of Summit Outfitters hissed open, and through them walked Sergeant Major Eva Hayes. She was in her blue dress A uniform, the iconic dress blues. The deep blue jacket was sharp, adorned with a constellation of ribbons and medals that told the story of a 2-decade career. The red stripe down her trousers was a slash of color against the store's muted tones. Her posture was ramrod straight, her gaze sweeping the store with an economy of movement that was both calm and commanding. She had just come from a formal ceremony at the base and had decided to surprise her daughter. The entire dynamic of the scene shifted on a dime. Shoppers turned, their conversations faltering. The sight of that uniform on that woman demanded respect, and it got it instantly. Deputy Ellison's smirk froze on his face. He saw her, but his brain took a moment to process what his eyes were telling him. He saw a black woman, then he saw the uniform, and then his eyes landed on the intricate, bursting bomb insignia of a Sergeant Major E9 on her sleeve. The smirk didn't just fade, it was wiped clean, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. Layla's head snapped up. A choked, relieved sob escaped her lips. "Mom!" Eva Hayes didn't rush. She assessed the scene in a single, sweeping glance. Her daughter's tear-streaked face, the smug deputy who now looked profoundly uncomfortable, the silent, watching crowd, and the glint of a phone camera lens. And then she moved. She walked toward them, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. She stopped beside Layla, placing a firm, reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder. The warmth of that touch seemed to flow through Layla, a wave of strength that pushed back the tide of shame. Eva ignored the crowd. She ignored the sneakers. She looked directly and only at Deputy Mark Ellison. The silence stretched, becoming a weapon in itself. Ellison, flustered, was the first to break it. He cleared his throat, forcing a politeness that sounded hollow. "Ma'am, just a little misunderstanding here. Kids, you know." Ava's voice, when she finally spoke, was low, calm, but it cut through his stammering excuse like a shard of glass. She didn't ask a question. She gave a command. "Explain to me what's happening. Now." It was no longer a conversation. It was an interrogation. And Deputy Ellison was completely unprepared. His confidence, so abundant just moments before, evaporated under her steady gaze. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the fabric of his polo shirt suddenly seeming too tight. "Look, we were just talking. Your daughter, she was telling a story." Eva's hand remained on Layla's shoulder, a silent anchor. "A misunderstanding," she repeated, her voice devoid of emotion. "Doesn't end with my daughter in tears. What was the story she told you?" Ellison licked his lips, his eyes darting around as if seeking an escape route. She said you were in the Marines, Special Forces." "I see," Eva said, her expression unreadable. "And you found that amusing?" "No, I thought she was exaggerating. It's unusual, you know?" "Unusual." Eva echoed the word, letting it hang in the air between them. "So you laughed. You stood here in front of all these people, and you laughed at my daughter for telling the truth." It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the precision of a marksman. Ellison's face began to flush a blotchy red. "Now hold on, I didn't call her a liar." "You didn't have to," Eva countered, her voice dropping even lower, forcing him to lean in slightly to hear. "You laughed, and your laughter told her, and everyone else here, that you believed she was one. You didn't laugh because she was wrong. You laughed because you couldn't possibly imagine she could be right." She took a small step closer, and her voice became steel. "Let's be very clear, Deputy. You couldn't imagine a black woman could be a sergeant major in the Marine Corps, could you? A former Raider, at that? That's the look you were talking about, isn't it? The one that doesn't look like me." The accusation, now spoken aloud, was devastating. The air crackled. Ellison opened his mouth, then closed it again, no denial forthcoming. Eva gestured subtly to the decorations on her own chest. "Do you know what these are? They aren't props from a movie set. Each one is a year, a mission, a promise kept. My daughter knows this. She doesn't see a fairy tale. she sees her mother's life. A life you decided to turn into a joke in the middle of a shoe store. She took another small step. You looked at my 12-year-old child, and you decided that her reality didn't fit with your assumptions. So you, a law enforcement officer, used the weight of your authority to publicly correct her. The mother with the stroller, who had been watching with rapt attention, muttered to her husband, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "He's done." The sentiment rippled through the crowd. The quiet judgment of strangers was now a palpable force, and it was aimed squarely at Deputy Mark Ellison. He tried to salvage the situation, turning his attention to Eva as if she were the only one he needed to convince. "Look, Sergeant Major, I apologize if I offended you." Eva held up a hand, a small, sharp gesture that stopped his words cold. "Don't apologize to me." Her gaze was like a physical force, directing his attention downward. "Look at her. An apology is for the person you harmed. If this moment of truth resonates with you, take a second to tap subscribe. We believe in honoring service with real stories, and the most important part is coming." The crowd watched, holding its breath. This was more than a scolding. It was a lesson in accountability, delivered in front of a jury of his peers. The air was thick with a tense, waiting silence. Ellison's reddening face, Ava's unwavering posture, Layla's chin held high for the first time in what felt like an eternity. It was a tableau of shifting power, a quiet, dramatic moment where the world was being set right again. Ellison swallowed hard, the sound audible in the hush. He glanced at Layla, at her wet but defiant eyes, and then quickly looked away. He muttered toward the floor, the words thick with resentment. "Sorry, kid." The apology was hollow, a coin tossed into a well of shame. It wasn't enough. Not for Ava. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of command. "Try again." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. Ellison stood frozen for a long moment, the internal war visible on his face, the last vestiges of his pride battling against the overwhelming weight of public shame. He muttered under his breath, "This is ridiculous." But a sharp, unwavering look from Ava silenced him. There was no escape. The deputy was no longer a figure of authority. He was a disappointment. He was failing this very public test of character. His shoulders, which had been puffed out with self-importance, now sagged. He took a deep breath, the air of a man defeated, and finally looked Layla directly in the eye. His voice was louder this time, clearer, stripped of its earlier arrogance. "Layla," he said, using her name properly. I am sorry. I shouldn't have laughed at you. I shouldn't have said what I said. You were telling the truth, and I didn't believe you. That was wrong of me." The words, finally genuine, landed. Layla felt a knot in her chest that she hadn't even realized was there begin to loosen. She held his gaze for a second longer, then looked up at her mother, who gave the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. But Ava wasn't finished. She looked at the red sneakers, then back at Ellison. "You made a promise," she said, her voice flat. "A deal. You owe my daughter a pair of shoes, the final humiliation." Ellison's face went from red to pale. He fumbled for his wallet, his hands shaking slightly. He walked to the checkout counter, Layla and Eva following. He placed his credit card on the counter, not looking at the cashier, not looking at anyone. The cashier scanned the box. "That'll be $64.99, she said, her voice neutral. The sound of the transaction, the beep of the machine, the printing of the receipt, echoed in the silent store. A single person in the crowd started to clap. It was a tentative sound at first, but then another joined and another, until a wave of supportive applause filled the aisle. It wasn't loud or boisterous, but steady and firm, a verdict delivered. The applause wasn't just for Ava, it was for Layla. It was for the truth. And as Ellison snatched his receipt and retreated, his face burning, Ava had one final lesson to teach. She didn't address him again. She turned her focus to the silent, watching crowd, her voice carrying with a calm clarity. "This isn't just about one man's poor judgment," she said. "It's about how easy it is to dismiss something or someone just because it doesn't fit what we expect to see. My daughter's truth was simple, but for him, it was easier to assume she was lying than to adjust his own worldview." Heads nodded in the crowd. People looked at each other, a shared understanding passing between them. "How many times does that happen?" Ava continued, her question hanging in the air. "How many children grow up learning to quiet their voices because they're afraid an adult will laugh instead of listen?" The man in the baseball cap, who had been watching from the start, finally stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, his voice full of respect. "Thank you for your service and thank you for that." Ava gave him a single appreciative nod before her attention returned to the most important person in the room. She knelt, bringing herself down to Layla's eye level, the sharp creases of her uniform bending with the movement. The scent of starch and clean wool filled the air around Layla, a smell she associated with safety, with home. "Layla," she said softly, her voice for her daughter alone, "you listen to me. You never, ever have to be ashamed of my truth or yours. If someone out there can't handle it, that is their weakness, not yours. Do you understand?" Tears welled in Layla's eyes again, but this time they were tears of overwhelming pride and relief. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Ava's gaze softened. "I know," she whispered, but then her expression shifted. A shadow passed over her features, a flicker of a pain far deeper than the afternoon's humiliation. She remained kneeling, her hand still on Layla's shoulder, but her eyes seemed to look past her, into a distance filled with memories. "But there's something else you need to understand, baby girl," she said, her voice now a low, aching whisper that made Layla's heart clench. Sometimes the uniform isn't enough to make them see." A hush fell over the few people still lingering. The man in the baseball cap frowned, confused. Eva took a shaky breath. "The reason I was at a ceremony today wasn't for a promotion, it was a memorial." Her voice broke on the last word. "We lost someone from my unit last month. A good man, a father, Sergeant Evans. He was the best of us." She looked over Layla's head at Ellison, who had stopped his retreat, frozen by the sudden raw shift in tone. "He saved my life," Eva said, her voice flat, heavy with a truth that cost everything. "We were pinned down, an ambush. He pushed me out of the line of fire. He took the rounds that were meant for me." The air in the store turned to ice. The fluorescent lights seemed to hum with a terrible new knowledge. The story was no longer about a bully and a hero. It was about a hero and a ghost. "I am here today," Eva said, her eyes locking with Ellison's, and in them he saw not anger, but a profound, bottomless grief. "I am standing here in this uniform because another Marine, a white man who saw me as his sister, not as a color or a gender, died so that I could come home to my daughter. He didn't see anything unusual about me. He just saw his sergeant major." She stood slowly, her hand resting on the metal ribbons on her chest, a gesture of both pride and pain. "So when you laugh," Eva said, her voice now resonating with the full weight of her sacrifice and her loss, "when you decide who does and does not belong, you are not just insulting me. You are insulting his memory. You are spitting on the grave of a man who died believing in a Corps where the only color that matters is Marine Corps green." No one clapped. No one spoke. The silence was absolute, filled only with the crushing weight of a hero's burden laid bare in the middle of a shoe store. Deputy Ellison stood there, his face pale, his earlier arrogance replaced by a look of utter, devastating shame. He had not just been wrong, he had been profane. Eva held her daughter close for a long moment, then released her. She looked at the red Aeroflex box in Layla's hands. "Come on," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears, but steady once more. "Sergeant Evans would have wanted you to have fast shoes." As they walked towards the exit, a path seemed to clear for them. The whispers that followed them now were not of ridicule, but of a deep, sorrowful awe. They left the store, leaving behind a corrected world and a profound lesson on the cost of disrespect. The mall faded into the distance as they drove home, but the lesson remained. Heroes don't just fight on battlefields. Sometimes, the biggest fight is for dignity, for memory, and for the right to stand in the light, even when you carry the shadows of those who fell so you could. If you believe we must honor the sacrifices of heroes like Sergeant Evans, drop a Semper Fi in the comments to show your respect, and subscribe for more stories that must never be forgotten.